Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Antaramian. I am an assistant professor of history and the holder of the Turpanjan Family Chair in Armenian Studies here at USC. On behalf of the Institute for Armenian Studies, I'd like to thank you for joining us today as we commence with today's discussion, What Happened and Why. Dealing with a topic such as genocide is never easy, as it challenges us to confront difficult and emotionally fraught questions. Denial, or otherwise excusing or justifying acts of collective violence, merely serves to perpetuate and reinscribe the stark imbalance of power existing between victim and perpetrator, and thus produces a series of false equivalencies that ignore or mitigate the existence of deeply embedded structural inequalities. These stratagems for deploying or justifying collective violence are not limited, however, to acts of genocide, but instead hold relevance today. One need only look at the justifications offered this past summer during Operation Protective Edge, or look at our most recent political cycle whenever we hear the words hard work or government handout invoked, to understand that these narrative devices are pervasive in our society today. Today we will turn to two leading scholars to discuss denialism and justification as it relates to the violence committed against the Ottoman Armenian community during the First World War. The first of our scholars is Professor Don Miller, who is a professor of religion here at USC and the director of the Center for Religion and Civic Culture. Professor Miller has made many forays into the question of genocide. Most recently, he has been working on Rwanda, although you've now moved on from that, haven't you? Or are you still working on it? However, his first foray into the question of genocide coincided with his work on his book Survivors, co-authored with his wife Lorna, which was published in 1993. Survivors, for me at least, was a very welcome intervention as it, for the first time, really moved the discussion of the Armenian genocide away from the polemics that surrounded that topic. Did it happen? Did it not happen? And really looking at macro social issues, macro structural issues, and really recapturing the humanity of the people that actually survived these events. Our second discussant is Professor Fatma Müge Göçek from the University of Michigan. We're very happy to be hosting Professor Göçek today. She is professor of sociology and women's studies. Professor Göçek has written extensively on the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, and the Republic of Turkey, but underpinning most of her work is an exploration of the continuities that link the late Ottoman Empire with the Republic of Turkey. Only recently have scholars really been studying the Armenian genocide, and this comes out in the works of people such as Taner Akçam, Uğur Üngör, and Donald Bloxham. Have they started to look at the genocide not from the perspective of the victims in this bottom-up narrative, but have begun to look at this from the vantage point of the perpetrators, which really reveals to us the dynamics of genocide. And I think really tells us a lot more about this as a social and historical phenomenon. The crux of our discussion today will focus on Professor Göçek's most recent work, Denial of Violence, which was just recently published by Oxford University Press. This book is the first that I have encountered, and I'm sure it will be considered a real watershed in our study of this period, that situates denialism in the context of a culture of difference, and how it is perpetuated and reinforced over a long period of time and links generations together in acts such as this. Before delving too much more into the book, I will turn the floor over to our discussants. Please join me in welcoming Professors Donald Miller and Müge Göçek.
Good afternoon. I want to give a brief commercial for this wonderful book that I finished reading this morning after getting up at 5 a.m. And it is an extremely original book, as you're going to see during the course of our discussion this afternoon. And I think it's a landmark study, as Richard just mentioned. And it's available, at least for the moment, on Amazon for $63. And the more copies that are purchased, the more likely it's going to come out in paperback. But it's, as you'll see as we progress in our conversation this afternoon, it's original in its methodology. It is truly a labor of love. And it's a book that I think has been a dozen years in the making or thereabouts. And what I want to begin with actually is to ask you some questions from the preface, but we'll work our way through this book. I love reading the preface of books. It's one place that an author has permission to actually say something personal. And so my first question is, tell us a little bit about your own family upbringing. And when did you first start to stumble a little bit on this issue of Armenians and non-Muslims in the Republic of Turkey?
Thank you very much, Donald, and thank you all of you, especially Richard Antaramian, who I had the pleasure to work with at the University of Michigan. I was on his dissertation committee, and I'm delighted that he's here. You're very lucky to have him. He's an amazing scholar. And also to Salpi Gazarian for organizing this, and thank you for hosting me here as well. It is a labor of love. It took me 12 years, and when I went into it, I had no idea it was going to be so difficult to go through the minefield because it was so politicized. My own experience in the Turkish context was almost very naive and innocent, so to speak. I come from an upper-class Istanbul family, ethnic Turkish, for many generations. We are what is referred to as the White Turks. Because I was in Istanbul, and when I was growing up, I did have, of course, around me lots of Greek, Rum, Armenians, and Jews, because my father was a business person, and as a consequence, of course, I had people around me, and to the benefit of my parents, I never thought they were different in any way. So I wasn't aware of that difference. And in Robert College, too, there was a lot of diversity. But I did not see that difference. I became aware of that difference much later when I came to the United States, interestingly enough, because here, of course, the lines in diaspora always become more polarized, and that's when I became aware of the difference much more. Then, looking back, I could also see inherent acts of racism, discrimination, prejudice that I hadn't been aware of as I was growing up, because it takes time to develop critical consciousness, especially for one like me, who I gather had naturalized being a member of the dominant majority. And that is probably the most important lesson I learned. I was able to eventually see, through writing this book, what life is like for those who do not belong to the dominant majority. So that has been my great gain. In the process, I lost a lot of friends that I grew up with. I made a lot of new ones, which were good because I could choose them in any way I wanted. And the issue was often over, of course, my stand on the Armenian genocide. A lot of people said, why are you going into this? You have, children, and, aren't you afraid? I said, it's my only luxury as a scholar is to go into this because I can study what I'm interested in. I don't, otherwise I should go do something else. So that didn't work, but a lot of our friends, family friends, tried to pressure my brother and my father and said, you should do something about your girl. She's like doing too much, So I had to get all their emails, and I wrote them an email, and I said, look, What I said, I'm an adult. You have any problem, talk to me. Do not talk to my brother or my father. And also I said, in addition, shame on you. You are the most educated people in this country. You should be the most tolerant and open to these ideas. So after that, at least, they stopped harassing my parents or my, brother and father. So those have been the major, experiences with my childhood friends. As I said, some of them were fine, others were not, and we moved on. And I think I'm a better person because of that.
So in 2002, I think probably early on in your research process, you decided that you would travel in Eastern Turkey, or what Armenians might describe as Western Armenia. And I believe 5 different summers you did this. I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of an insight into your experience. Who was your guide, your traveling companion? What impact did those 5 summers have on you personally?
It was very important for me to get a sense of where Armenians once lived, what gave meaning to their lives. I mean, these were their ancestral lands, and I wanted to see if anything remained. And for them, for that reason, it was important. But the main reason for me to go the first year was whenever I gave talks on this until that point, many Armenians came to me afterwards and they said, "You must be Armenian." I said, "I'm not. I don't think so." They said, "You must be Armenian because Turks cannot say the things you're saying, so you must have some Armenian blood in you." I said, "Well, I don't know. I don't think so." They would say, "But you look just like my aunt," And I'd say, "Why, thank you." And then, likewise, Turks would come and they would say, "You must be Armenian." And I'm saying, "I don't think so. I'm ethnically Turkish." They would say, "No Turk in their right mind would say the things you're saying, so your blood must be tainted with Armenian blood." So I said, my blood is obviously going to be important to these people. Let me go to and check the ancestral places that my family came from. So of the 4, 3 were, I knew didn't come from the area. The 4th one was very circumspect. I mean, this was sort of suspicious because it was in near Agan, in a place, a village that used to be called Başvartenik, and is now called Başpınar. So I said, if anything, there's going to be something there. But I'd never been there, and my great-grandfather had migrated from there around 1903 or so to Istanbul. He had come. So I wanted to go, and I had, by that point, the extraordinary fortune of having Hrant Dink as a friend, and of course, and a colleague, and we were very close. And I went that summer, I said, "Hrant, shall we go there? I'd love to go with you." And he said, well, no, he had the reunion of his high school, Armenian high school, so he couldn't, but he said, "I'll have Baron Seropian take you," Sarkis Seropian, who is the Armenian editor and owner of Agos newspaper. Baron Seropian's wife permitted him, insofar as he ate properly, he put on his hat so that he doesn't get too much sun, and that he called her every day. He muttered, but then he held on to that, and then we went on, and that is how we went. And the reason he wanted to come, I wanted to go to the village to see what the story was about my family. He wanted to come because his grandfather and grandmother had been a part of the convoys. He had lost his grandfather, who was a doctor in the North Black Sea region, because the doctor treated soldiers who were, treated patients who were not soldiers. The Union and Progress, or the Young Turk governor, basically just put him into one of the convoys and he disappeared. And then his grandmother, was a young kid, of course. Then they were put onto the next convoy, and on their way to Deir Zor, Agan was one of the places where they alighted. It was a stopping point. And when they were there, through a great miracle, they survived, because in Adapazarı, because the Armenian existence, of course, in Asia Minor is much older than the Turkish one, they were under Byzantine rule. They had to use Greek liturgy as opposed to Armenian liturgy. As a consequence, all the Armenians knew Greek, so they would talk Greek among themselves on the deportation route. And the soldiers said, if you're Greek, you're not supposed to be in this, deportation. So therefore, they stayed in there. And of course, they didn't say, oh no, we're not Greek, we're Armenian. They just went along with it. And they stayed in Agan for 3 months until they sent a telegram to find out if they were or not. And then in the end, they couldn't determine it, and they were saved. But he said his grandmother always talked about Agan, how beautiful it was, the water, so he wanted to come. So both of us, in a way, were there to find out about our pasts. And that is how we started this whole friendship. For 5 summers we went, and every summer we had different people come with us. I invited one summer, Richard Hovhannisyan came with us, Meline Tumani, Razmik Panosyan, François Antonian. So we had different people coming with us, and we had a fascinating time. And of course, most of what I saw, Baron Saropian is amazing, because every year in the winter he would dream and have nightmares about what was remaining of all the monasteries of the places. He said, in my dream I thought there was another crack in one of them. I mean, he lived and died. He still feels very strongly about all of those ruins. We would find them, go and visit them. We did the same, of course, when Richard Hovhannisyan came. And afterwards, I went to one of the slideshows that Richard Hovhannisyan gave, luckily. It was fascinating, because at that slideshow, I saw what those places were like before they were ruins. And that, to me, was a revelation, because I had only known them as ruins. And then I understood the level of trauma losing all that material culture and civilization must have been as well. So those are, yes, my travels, and then we had other adventures with the secret police and everything, but I won't go into that. Yeah.
Well, let's dive in to the methodology of this book. And what is clearly unique in my reading of it is that you rely heavily on memoirs. And these are not memoirs of Armenians. These are memoirs of Turkish citizens. And so I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. First of all, why did you select memoirs? How many memoirs did you read? And then what was your actual process of analysis? And there's another sort of side of this, which, without getting too theoretical and methodological, I have a strong feeling it's linked to some of your own interest in women's studies and critical theory and so forth. So if you could unpack that for us, that'd be very useful.
Of course, thank you. To me, I thought people obsessed and focused exclusively on 1915-17, because that, of course, was the most dramatic moment of the collective violence committed against the Armenians. But I also knew there was, of course, the 1894-96 massacres that preceded it. And, of course, there was a lot of violence afterwards as well, after the genocide. So, to me, I had no interest, like most of the people did, in sort of writing yet another book in demonstrating that it was a genocide, because to me that's a non-issue. Of course it is. For me, what was more interesting was why did Turkish state and society deny what happened for so long? That to me was a much more interesting issue. And of course, one of the fundamental premises of that denial is they say, well, all the eyewitness accounts by Armenians, all the Westerners, all of those are biased, and therefore they can dismiss it. I said, well, if they can dismiss those, and since the official documents usually are, in addition, they only give the state view and they don't capture the meaning of what it meant and how people negotiated what was going on around them. I said, let me find a source that will enable me to capture what goes on in people's everyday lives, and also let this be told from the point of view of actually the Turkish officials and officers, so that they can't say, the official historiographers won't be able to then say, oh, by the way, you know, those were also not telling the truth, because they, of course, were. I mean, and these are the heroes, so-called, of the Republic. And that's why I decided it would be important to look at all the memoirs written in Turkey, in Turkish, that somehow had within them some information about the violence committed in society. Not necessarily only against the Armenians, but, you know, of course, that was the primary one, but in general, about, you know, other minorities or violence as such. And that is why I decided to then systematically look at these memoirs nobody had done before. That's why it took a long time to write the book as well. I read about 700 memoirs. In all, I have 307 memoirs that I used for this book, 307 memoir writers, and 354 texts, because some people wrote more than one memoir. And what I did was I would read each one. I was brought up bilingually, so it's easy for me to read it in Turkish and then write it in English. So I took all my notes. I had 1,000 pages of notes, in all single-spaced, and then I looked through that and saw the patterns of violence that emerged, and I think that makes it a more interesting book, because it comes from within, and since your own work is on oral histories, you know how wonderfully exciting such work can be, you and your wife's works, yeah.
So I want to come back to some of these methodological issues, but before doing that, there are three principal claims that the Turkish government and lobbyists regularly make. And I'd like you just to respond briefly to each of these, because each one could be a lecture. But one is that in 1915, these were just relocation, maybe deportations, but relocation with the idea that Armenians would be returning to their homes. Okay, so that's sort of point one. Point two, that Armenian revolutionaries killed as many Turks as Armenians were killed by Turkish gendarmes or others. Point three, that maybe at most 300,000 Armenians perished, but this was largely because of wartime conditions. Okay, so I think those are the sort of three arguments that say that this was not a genocide that was premeditated. And based on your research, the memoirs, and certainly other knowledge that you have, how would you respond to each of those points?
Well, of course, none of them are true. That will be the brief answer. But and those are what I have I analyzed 1789 to 2009, 220 years, to demonstrate how the collective violence against the Armenians started as a consequence of modernity and the polarization that set in with modernity, but I won't go into that too much. The whole idea about it being relocation and not destruction is my second stage of denial. The first stage is, there is the initial stage of denial where the Ottoman state denies that the origins of the Armenian problem are located domestically. They're due to the failures of the reforms that they try to promulgate. So that is the first one. The second one is during the Young Turk period, and that's the one where you say they basically transfer with the intent to destroy, but of course they claim that was not the case. Well, if you look at many of the memoir writers are actually Union and Progress people, and I think about 5 or 6 of them belong to the special organization, the Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa. So if you look at what they have said, it becomes very evident that the intent was destruction all along. So that's that, I guess. With respect to the numbers, that sets on later in the third and, well, there is the third stage of genocide, denial, which happens with the transformation from empire to nation state, where the former perpetrators of the genocide become the heroes of the Turkish Republic. As a consequence, they get whitewashed from all their basically violence they perpetrated, and they don't have to account for them. Not only that, they become actually rewarded for it by very important positions, important ones being 2 presidents, İsmet İnönü and Celal Bayar, many ministers, Tevfik Rüştü Aras and others, a lot of deputies. So, I have all lists of all the people who were, so that is one reason, of course. And with respect to the numbers, what they do is they try for a while, the Turkish state tries to get the academics to do a lot of research. And I remember when I was a graduate student at Princeton getting letters saying, you should work on the Armenian issue, and if you do, we'll give you all the funding you need. And I said, well, I don't want to commit academic suicide, of course, and I didn't do it. But nevertheless, it turns out at the time collected, this is according to Kamran Gürün, who's actually, who's written the Armenian dossier, one of the major denialist accounts. He invited a lot of Turkish academics to Ankara and said, okay, we want you to go and demonstrate how violent Armenians are in history. And the scholar said, he writes in his memoirs, not only did they not listen to us, but they even told us what we should be doing instead, and they didn't like our idea. So obviously, the scholars didn't fall for it. So what he did was he got a lot of retired diplomats. He sent them to the archives, and they basically mined all the material without having any idea about methodology. So as a consequence, took only the parts of what happened in the past in a way that equated the two. And that is, I call the last stage, the denial of responsibility, came because of that faulty official historiography. And that's why you have all these numbers that are totally skewed. Mm-hmm. And they also, in those numbers, equate, for example, all the losses of the Ottoman state, including military losses of soldiers who died in the war front. I always say it's not comparing apples and oranges. It's like apples and mushrooms. I mean, we're talking serious difference. Of course, the Armenians who were massacred were women, children, elderly, and they were civilians. They were not soldiers, but they do not make that nuanced difference because they're retired diplomats and they have no idea about how to do historical research.
One thing that really intrigued me, and it's in a sense almost a methodological tool for you, and that is to pay attention to the silences, that is, the things that are not in these memoirs. And so my question actually is, what impact is silence having on the Turkish people, and maybe even on government policy, but also flipping that around, what impact has that silence, that denial, had on the Armenian people? So if you could sort of look at both of those lenses.
Well, of course, my focus on the silence is because of critical theory that I'm very interested in, and Foucault, and he says one has to look at what is not said just as much as what is said. And the good thing about looking at 354 texts is that it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and what one person doesn't say, usually someone else does without being aware of it. So if you all put it together, you can see the silences much more. And then you realize that's what propaganda is all about. It's just basically relaying selective information, leaving everything that is detrimental to what the ideological position one holds out of the narrative. So that is why I paid a lot of attention to the silences, because that was where all the violence was hidden. And that I think I was able to bring forward. And what is fascinating is that, that also, of course, becomes extremely detrimental, because one thing I realized when I started working on this issue is when I talked to especially diaspora Armenians, and we mentioned about the genocide. You would think 1915 happened a couple of months ago. I mean, that it's very recent, because the pain, the suffering is still with them, which one realizes is the case because they haven't had a chance to heal. They call denial the last stage of genocide, because it basically takes the healing power away by not acknowledging the pain and suffering. The same way, of course, with the Turks, is they have no recollection, and they have no intention of discussing what happened in 1915 to 17. So, I mean, one tries desperately, to not remember it, and the other one tries desperately, cannot forget it because it is so ingrained. I mean, so that is why I think it works in very different ways. And so from the Armenian point of view, of course, this is a crime against humanity, one that has to be acknowledged, especially for the Turks, by the Turks, so that people can together heal and move on, and restore one's trust in humankind. That is, of course, the most important thing you lose when you are subject to such violence. From the Turkish point of view, too, I mean, there is this sense in Turkey that, well, we have to recognize this in Turkey because this is, because Armenians want it. No, I think Turkish society has suffered a lot. Turkey has not been able to become a democratic society. Turkey still has normalized violence because they didn't account for it. And I think the moral fabric in Turkish society has dissipated because of this lack of recognition. So I tried to also demonstrate how much this not accounting for what I call the foundational violence of the Turkish Republic has led Turkish society into a moral crisis that they will only come out of if they can face their past and the violence embedded in it.
This next question, I suspect, might relate to a future book project. This silence, this denial of the Armenian genocide, how do you think that currently is playing out in the treatment of the Kurds, which obviously is very, very current, but even in terms of the future relationship between Turks and Kurds?
Well, I mean, you obviously are very prescient, because that is exactly what my next book project is. Because I was very interested, and I think demonstrated how not accounting for the violence committed against the Armenians not only led to the destruction of course, you know, trust in humanity and the destruction of the Armenians, but also was then normalized into Turkish society in a way that all those who perpetrated the violence against the Armenians, who then became leaders of the republic, went on and, surprise, surprise, were then the leaders that perpetrated violence against the Kurds next. So what I want to do is now look at, study the violence against the Kurds, and to see how similar or different that was from the violence against the Armenians, because you're indeed right. I mean, that was the continuation, and it is a pattern of violence that continues to this day in Turkey, in the form of intolerance against all those who are not the same with the dominant majority.
Your most personal chapter is your last chapter.
Yeah.
And you earlier mentioned Hrant Dink. I'm not sure if everyone knows who he was, so it might be useful just to describe him. But my question focuses on why was he assassinated? And you make some very interesting points about the role of emotion in this book, and how emotion, particularly emotions related to fear and anxiety, are keyed to particular events, not so much sort of the facts of what has happened. So I'm wondering if you could sort of really sort of drill into that last chapter. Yeah. Tell us why you think Hrant Dink was assassinated. Yeah. How did that relate to preceding events?
Well, I always said, and I always will say, that I think he was assassinated because he was an Armenian. I mean, you know, I knew him when he came to the workshop on Armenian Turkish scholarship, Watts group that Ron Suni and I at the University of Michigan had started to bring together like-minded scholars who would want to study these issues without getting pulled into politics. And the first meeting we held at the University of Chicago, where Ron was at the time, in 2002. For the second one, we realized that this was such a crucial issue. We had to also bring in some journalists, public intellectuals, especially from Turkey. And for that one, we invited 3 journalists, and Hrant Dink was one of them. And I insisted on Hrant because I also thought it was very important to get the perspective of the Armenians in Turkey, in addition to Armenians in the diaspora. At that time, until then, the Turkish state did not give Hrant Dink a passport, because they did not want him to leave the country, because he was a very significant public intellectual. He published a newspaper, and also he was able to speak and acknowledge not only the issue of what happened to the Armenians, but also all human rights issues in Turkey. But for that, the miracle occurred. Hrant said, I'd love to come, but they don't give me a passport, but just, why don't you send me an invitation just in case? So I sent an invitation. Miracle of miracles, he was able to leave the country for the first time. So that is how we became friends. And he was very excited about all the work we were doing. But I now look back and realize all of us in that group were mostly white Turks. He was the only exception. But he was extremely important because he, I think, challenged this Turkish state in the way that he was able to make us all envision a society where people were living equally in a democratic way, in a future society. And that probably is a vision that is still with all of us, even though they violently took him away from us. But I think it is that vision that also makes us continue and it certainly made me write this book. I became even more determined to write it after he was assassinated, and the book is dedicated to my 2 children, because I was a single mother raising them, and they thought this book will never end because I worked on it for so long, so they deserved it. The other ones are the 3 grandchildren of Hrant Dink, because they will never know how loving their grandfather would have been towards them. And I hope that with the dedication to the children, the next generation will be able to live together peacefully in a way we certainly could not.
In a few minutes, we're going to open the floor to questions. We do have a mic here, but I want to get in a couple more of my questions first. Sure. Your publication date for this book is 2015. I think in this room we're all aware that that's also the 100th anniversary commemoration of the Armenian genocide. It's published by Oxford University Press, one of the foremost university presses in the world. The book's going to get a lot of attention. I'm wondering what you are thinking about strategies that Turkish lobbyists and the Turkish government may have in trying to blunt the perspective that you have in this book.
Well, let them come on. I don't care at this point. I've been struggling with them for the last 12 years. This isn't something new. From the beginning, I mean, I had no idea it was going to be so challenging. But for me, a very important turning point was Hrant Dink's assassination. At that point, I said, if this is, the extent they're going to go to, from this point onward, I said, I do not care. I'm going all the way myself. So let them come on. I mean, I'm ready. I don't think there's anything they can do about it, and I don't think they honestly have anything to stand on at this point. That's why I call it a labor of love, because I wanted to put in everything there to the best of my ability. And hey, I've done it. From now on, the book is out, so whatever happens to me happens. It doesn't matter, really. And I think we as scholars, our duty is to do the research and present it, and then to society. And what the public does with it is up to them. I'm not a strategist and I'm not a politician, so I don't know where the book will go, but the book will speak for itself. And I'm going to go to Turkey in December. There are a couple of different presses that want to publish it in Turkish. So I'll decide which one to go with when I'm there. It'll come out in Turkish as well. And I gave a talk, actually, before coming here, the beginning of October. The first talk I gave on the book was in Turkey, in Turkish, at the History Foundation. And you can go into, well, you have to know Turkish, but if you go onto their website, they have a podcast of the whole talk I gave. There were more than 120 people. They all listened to the book, and I summarized it in Turkish. They were fine with it. I mean, a few of my friends were very disappointed that nothing exciting happened afterwards, so that they would have to, defend me, protect me, and fight it out or whatever. So I don't know. It looks like times are changing, and I always say there is an expression in Turkish. You say, "Güneş balçıkla sıvanmaz." You cannot cover the sun with clay. It just doesn't hold. This is the truth, and it's going to come out one time or the other. And if I could contribute at least one little iota to that, that's all I care about. Thank you.
1.5 more questions, and then we'll open to the floor. In the last few pages of that last chapter, you actually, there's a little bit of hope that, not that there's a paradigm shift yet, but you see some signs that there may be changes, shifts in public opinion, certainly within the Turkish population at large. I'm wondering if you could just give us a couple of examples of what makes you personally hopeful.
Well, it depends on the day and if the sun is out too. And you know, if I were in California all the time, I would be much more of an optimist than I am at Michigan, you know, where it's overcast. I'm just teasing. But, you know, I am hopeful for a couple of reasons. I'm hopeful because of the younger generation. You know, I work with them. Obviously, they get in contact with me. And I know the younger generation cares about much more about the problems in the past. And initially, and now even more, a lot of people from Turkey are studying the Armenian, and ethnic Turks are studying the Armenian and Kurdish problems. And that is what is more important. I always said from the beginning, and this is what I learned, of course, from gender theory and race theory. For one to become a minority, there has to be a majority that produces that. And for this issue, the Armenian issue is an issue because the Turks made it an issue. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the Turks to take this on and to analyze it. And that is why I decided I should be the one doing it. Because you can't ask those who had been victimized, you know, to sort of ask them why they have been victimized. That's not right, because there were perpetrators. That's why they're victimized. And you have to study and understand the reasoning behind those who perpetrated those events. So from that point of view, I'm very hopeful that many of the more educated ethnic Turkish students come. They want to learn Armenian, they want to learn Kurdish. I say, well, maybe you should study something else. No, they say this is what we need to do if we want to become a better society. So the youth always excite me from that point of view. Other than that, I was also hopeful initially about the Islamist government because Turkey was militantly secular, and I thought the Islamists therefore would have more compassion towards others like themselves who were, you know, very much obviously aggressed upon. But rather than having compassion, they are set on revenge. And, you know, that's the other sad thing is that, you know, I am not happy with the policies of the Justice and Development Party at the moment. It was a good start, but I think they're going downhill. But, you know, as I said, hopefully one has to think long term and trust in the youth and in their ideals and visions.
There's a sentence I love in your book. It actually is very early on in that preface. I just want to read it and have you comment. And then please make your way here to this mic if you have a question or a comment. The sentence is this. I now realize that the common thread that unites us is that we define each other not first as Turks or Armenians, but rather first as human beings. And I'm clearly in that sentence, you're saying a lot about your own moral, perhaps even spiritual commitments, and your commitments to human rights. Could you just elaborate that a little more for us?
Sure. I mean, whenever, for example, I have a daughter and a son, whenever I raise them, I always said, you know, I said there are not all Americans are good, not all Turks are good. I said there are good people and there are bad people. And that is what you have to first acknowledge. And I myself became aware of this because in one context, very early on, it's a long story, but basically, in one context, somebody from the audience got up, an older Armenian lady, and she said, you know, how could Turkey think it could ever get anywhere, with tears coming down in her eyes, I mean, from her eyes, saying, when they massacred, you know, my entire family on the way to Deir Zor. At that point, my first reaction was, I got up and I said, I'm a mother too. I can feel how bad that must be for you. What can I do to help you? At that point, I saw her relax, and I saw all the emotions in the room of all the Armenians also dissipate. And I said, oh my God, this is what acknowledgement is all about. I mean, this is what acknowledging somebody's, emotions allows them to do, is to get rid of all that pent-up, emotion and frustration. And that is why emotions is a very important part of the book, of the theory. But in addition, I just did it instinctively because I had just become a mother, I guess. But I said, why did it work? It worked because I saw her as a suffering woman and a mother. I mean, and I obviously related to her first as a human being, and that stuck with me always. And I've always, tried extremely hard since then to treat everyone equally, first as human beings. I think that's the only way to peace, if we ever are going to have one in the world.
Well, let's thank our guests very much. So we have a few minutes for your questions, potentially your comments, and since we're taping this, if you could make your way up to the mic. Please just indicate your name.
Hi, my name is Tadevik Sarkisian. My question is, are you afraid of going back to Turkey because of your research and it's against, like the normal beliefs that Turkish people have about Armenians and the genocide? Are you afraid of going back and seeing their reaction, and how do you feel about that, going back to Turkey after all of this, after being published?
Well, no, actually, I am now relieved because I was worried about going back before finishing the book. Now that the book is finished, I can go. I mean, I really don't care at this point. It was getting this out that was the important thing. No, and what is important, nevertheless, is I do always talk and stay within academic settings. I do not give, interviews on newspapers, or, I don't get engaged directly with the mass public. I mean, that probably is the only caution I take. But no, I have been back, and so far nothing has happened. So, and at this point, as I said, the important thing is I got everything I had to say out of my chest. I mean, it was hard dealing with so much material. But at this point, my mission is done.
Other questions, comments? Please. Again, if you can just indicate your name.
Sure. My name is Atilla Kahveci, and you indicated in your book that the cycle of violence that was initiated by the Young Turks in the 1910s by the state, and then that ended the empire, and then went on to become the foundation of Turkish Republic. Now we see in the 1920s there was this Kurdish revolt, and there was a heavy clamping down on it in the 1920s. 1930s, we see the Alawites against the Alawites. That was the same kind of violence that was perpetrated in the 1940s. We see against the heavy taxation on the minorities. 50s, another kind of Taksim revolt that happened. 60, there was the coup. 70, another coup. 80, another coup, a very large coup. In 1990s, there was this problem of the Kurdish unsolved murders. It became a kind of a cycle.
Exactly.
An unending cycle. Now, with the recent things that we just shared with you, against the civic initiative, again violently, bankrupting a bank, plus what else? Closing down the schools of a civic initiative, and lastly, blocking the bank accounts of an aid organization, of that civic movement. So how are we going to end this cycle of violences that started with this, with the cycle of violence perpetrated against the Armenians by the state, by the Young Turks, and now we come in this. Every 10 years, we're facing a kind of a dilemma here.
Exactly.
How are we going to end this?
Well, I mean, the way you tell the Turkish history, it sounds like a nightmare, but it is indeed. If you look at it from the point of violence, it's like one cycle of violence over the other. Well, I think the only way to end it, of course, is to try to start to reflect on it, to acknowledge all of this, because people do not. It's always very easy in Turkey to identify an enemy. Usually as a way to fend off responsibility, taking responsibility for what happens. And, and it looks like we go from finding one enemy to another one. And I argued that, first there are always the external forces who are enemies, of course, but then after the Republic, there was, in order to keep this sort of monolithic notion of the nation state, the dominant majority, there were internal enemies that were identified one after another, and we thought that after especially, the recent opening with the EU membership possibility, things will be more transparent, but now the cycle still continues, and so how do we get out of it? I don't know. I mean, the only thing I could do as a scholar, as I have done in this book, is to demonstrate that violence and how we have to come to terms with it in a way, if we want Turkey to ever be a democratic society. Because when you realize the patterns and what leads to those patterns, the intolerance behind it, hopefully that will go away with time. But that is going to take a long time, that I know, because I've been working on it, for 12 years, and I was certain by 2015 the acknowledgement would come. And, things are going at such a glacial pace at this point, we have probably 10 to 20% of people in Turkey recognize, what happened. And the Kurds have apologized for what they did to the Armenians. So maybe that will bring it to like 30%. But the other 70 obviously has to be educated next.
I can tell Richard is going to steal away the podium. I have one question, which hopefully you can give a very quick answer to, and it's the why question. Why is the government of Turkey continuing to spend millions of dollars every year, year in, year out? Is it fear of reparations? Does it have to do with Turkish identity? What are the factors in your opinion?
Well, I mean, they always say reparations, will there be, will there not be? I mean, that's not, I think it's more than that. I think the major issue that I now think that they do not want to acknowledge it is because it is the foundational violence of the Turkish Republic, which means that they will have to entirely rewrite Turkish history. And then it will come evident that the independence war was not won by the blood, sweat, and tears of the Turks, but rather of the Armenians. That a lot of the wealth that is created in Turkey by the major, business people was not created because of those business people's initiative, but because of all the factories and wealth left over or forcefully taken from the Armenians. And also most of the officers, generals who are seen as the heroes of the Turkish Republic were actually perpetrators to start with. And that means the legitimacy of the entire republic, I think, would become destabilized, and they're worried Turkey will not survive as a country, as a political system. I think Turkey is going to self-destruct if it does not come to terms with what it did. So, and I think there is enough stamina in Turkey to survive, and it could become a much better society if it did. So on sunny days, I think it's going in the right direction. On days when it's overcast, I think it's going to self-destruct. So, I go back and forth on that one.
Okay, thank you so much.
So while I have your attention, I just wanted to share a couple of quick announcements. Firstly, if you found this talk interesting, do know that it won't be available online soon, so please tell your friends. And do also be aware that all Institute events are live streaming, so if you can't make it, you can at least join us through the internet. Secondly, we do have an email list sign-up sheet somewhere around here. In the back. So if you'd like to be made aware of more events, please do sign up so that we can invite you again in the future. On a final note, if you're a student, I have good news. I just learned that Doheny will be getting a copy of Professor Göcek's book next week. If you are not a student, I have good news as well. Don mentioned that he spent $63 on his copy through Amazon. If you pick up one of these flyers, which are floating around, you can get yours for only $52. So you can save yourself a few dollars extra. One more time, I think we should thank both professors, Don Miller and Müge Göçek.